Some people forget their place. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 14 minutes before a UH-60 Black Hawk landed on his hospital roof. St. Michael's ICU in Philadelphia smells like antiseptic and floor wax under fluorescent lights that hum at 120 cycles per second. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm from Bed 7, where Colonel James Rashid lay with shrapnel embedded 3 mm from his left anterior descending artery, a Delta Force officer evacuated from Ramadi 72 hours prior with a heart that refused to stabilize. Brooke Sullivan moved between monitors with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been invisible for 8 months, her scrubs 2 sizes too large, hiding a limp in her right leg that flared up when the barometric pressure dropped. Nobody noticed the limp. Nobody ever did. The blood pressure cuff deflated with a soft hiss as she charted Rashid's vitals, 95/60, dropping again, the systolic number bleeding down like sand through an hourglass. Her hands didn't shake. Her hands never shook. 20 years of training had baked steadiness into her muscle memory the way other people's bodies learn to walk. She adjusted the cardiac monitor, watching the QRS complex trace its fragile pattern across the screen. Normal sinus rhythm. Then a pause. Then normal again. The pauses were getting longer. How long has he been like this? The resident, Patterson, young enough to still believe medicine was about saving lives and not about hierarchy, stood at the foot of the bed with his tablet clutched like a shield. Brooke didn't look up from the 4 lines she was checking. Since 0300. Pressure's dropped 8 points in the last 4 hours. I've been monitoring for tamponade development. Tamponade. Patterson's voice pitched up half an octave. Did you notify Dr. Whitfield? He's aware. She was not going to tell him that Whitfield had dismissed her concerns twice. The first time at 2 in the morning when she'd mentioned the declining pressure and the subtle increase in JVD, jugular venous distension, that suggested fluid accumulating around the heart. He'd looked at her like she'd suggested the moon was made of cheese, then he'd said, the echo from yesterday was clear, Sullivan. You're seeing shadows. The second time was at 0600 when she documented it again, this time with more specificity, central venous pressure climbing, pulsus paradoxus becoming audible. He'd signed off on her note without reading past her name. In her locker on the 4th floor sat a pair of worn combat boots caked with Iraqi sand, the laces still knotted the way she'd tied them 20 years ago in Ramadi, the day she'd run through small arms fire to pull a screaming 6-year-old boy from a burning building during a firefight in the Jolan district. That boy had grown up. That boy was now a full bird colonel breathing through a tube. I need to run another set of vitals, Brooke said to Patterson. Can you log the BP in the chart? Patterson nodded and left. He was smart enough not to argue with the night nurse. Most of them were smart enough. It was the ones with confidence that became problems. Dr. Marcus Whitfield entered the ICU at 07:15, his white coat pressed sharp enough to cut, his shoes polished to a mirror finish that reflected the fluorescent lights like a message, I own this place. He was flanked by 2 residents, Okafor and Chen, who wrote down everything he said as if his words came from scripture. Whitfield's power source wasn't hard to identify. He'd been chief of cardiothoracic surgery for 15 years, and in that time he'd cultivated allies in administration, insurance, and the Pennsylvania Medical Board. One phone call and a competent surgeon could lose their privileges. One word in the right ear and a nurse could find their schedule suspended pending investigation. Good morning, staff, Whitfield announced, loud enough to turn heads at the nurse's station 30 feet away. He moved to Rashid's bedside like he owned it. Let's discuss our Delta Force colonel. Trauma admission, shrapnel injury, 3 days post-evac. Explain the clinical picture, Okafor. Okafor stammered through the presentation, penetrating cardiac injury with retained foreign body, ejection fraction declining from 58% to 41% despite optimal medical management, no intervention planned because the fragment was technically inoperable. We're monitoring for complications, Okafor finished. Whitfield nodded slowly, the way a predator nods at prey. And who, he said, turning toward Brooke at the monitor station, has been documenting these vitals with such enthusiasm? The question was a trap. They're always traps. Brooke didn't look up from the cardiac monitor. Routine nursing protocol, Dr. Whitfield. Routine. He repeated the word like it tasted bad. Sullivan, you've been documenting pressure drops, JVD changes, and pulses paradoxes for 6 hours. That's not routine. That's vigilant. He said vigilant the way someone says obsessive. That's the kind of documentation I see when a nurse has developed an inappropriate emotional attachment to a patient. The room went very quiet. The monitors kept their rhythm, beep, 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 indifferent to human drama. Chen stopped writing. A nurse 3 stations over turned away deliberately, a small mercy, pretending she hadn't heard. Brooke finished her notation on the cardiac assessment form and set her pen down on the counter with deliberate precision. No tremor. No hesitation. His vitals are declining, Brooke said. Her voice was flat. Professional. The voice of someone reporting weather. The clinical picture suggests developing cardiac tamponade. Fluid accumulation around the pericardium. Whitfield's jaw tightened. He didn't like being contradicted by someone in blue scrubs. His echo yesterday was clear, Sullivan. The fluid collection is minimal and stable. Yesterday's echo can't predict today's pathophysiology, Brooke said. Still flat. Still composed. Vitals don't lie. No, but nurses do. Embellish. Dramatize. Whitfield turned to his residents. This is what happens when someone forms an attachment to a patient. The clinical picture becomes distorted through emotional bias. She begins to see problems that don't exist, to document every small fluctuation as if it's a crisis. Chen scribbled notes. Recording the narrative. Creating the paper trail. This was how Whitfield operated. He built his case slowly, laying foundation before he swung the hammer. 15 years of experience had taught him that if you said it enough times in front of enough witnesses, it became true. The medical board cared about documentation. The hospital cared about liability. Everything came down to what was written in the chart. Brooke moved to Rashid's bedside and checked the foresight, her movements efficient and practiced. The limp was barely visible today. She didn't acknowledge Whitfield's presence. Ignoring him meant he couldn't rattle her. Ignoring him meant she wasn't playing his game. Sullivan, look at me. Whitfield's voice had dropped, which meant it was about to become a threat. I want to be clear about something. This patient needs to be allowed to progress naturally. Naturally means we monitor, we support, and we prepare the family for realistic outcomes. Realistic meaning he dies, Brooke said. She wasn't asking. She was stating. She was documenting in her own way, making sure there was a witness to what he wasn't saying. Whitfield's face flushed, a dark purple rising up his neck like ink dropped in water. I mean that a man with this injury, this level of deterioration, this poor prognosis should not be subjected to the false hope that aggressive intervention brings. That hope is cruelty. And yet his pressure is dropping and his fluid load is rising, Brooke said. Those are facts. The echo was 24 hours old. The clinical picture changes minute by minute. Whitfield stared at her for 3 seconds. It was a power stare, designed to make people fold, to make them apologize, to make them remember that he was the one with the authority and she was the one who'd forgotten her place. Brooke met his eyes briefly, long enough to be respectful, short enough to be dismissive, then returned to checking Rashid's lines. Get me 10 attending cardiologists' opinions on this patient, Whitfield said to Chen. I want documentation that this case has been reviewed by the department. I want to make sure we're aligned on the prognosis before anyone, he looked directly at Brooke, gets any ideas about escalating care. 10. He wanted 10 attending physicians on record saying the patient should be managed conservatively. 10 opinions to create a wall, a consensus, a shield against any single nurse who thought she knew better. 10 names on a document that would make heroic intervention look like insubordination. Whitfield walked away from the bedside, his residents trailing behind him like pilot fish. The morning light was starting to come through the east windows, turning the ICU's fluorescent glare into something softer, something that almost looked like grace. But grace was the privilege of people who didn't keep secrets, and Brooke Sullivan was nothing but secrets stacked on secrets, each one heavy enough to drown a person. At 09:40, Whitfield found her at the vending machines on the 4th floor. This was calculated. This was deliberate. The vending machines were in a corridor with minimal traffic, minimal visibility. Brooke was getting coffee, black, no sugar, the way she'd learned to drink it in the field when taste was irrelevant and caffeine was information. Whitfield appeared beside her like he'd been waiting. "I want to be very clear about something," he said. His voice was low. Conversational. Some people forget their place in a hospital hierarchy. They start to think that their observations matter more than the supervising physician's judgment. They think their nursing instincts override medical training and experience. That's when people get hurt. Brooke didn't respond. She inserted coins into the machine, 75 cents, exact change, mechanical precision. "Security is just a phone call away," Whitfield continued. "One call if I start to suspect that a nurse is operating outside her scope of practice. One call if I think someone's not following doctor's orders. One call and we can have you removed from this unit pending investigation by the state." The coffee dropped. It made a small thud in the metal collection box at the bottom of the machine. Brooke reached down and retrieved it, her hand steady, her face composed. When she turned to face Whitfield, her eyes were the color of cold water, not angry, not afraid, just reflective and impenetrable. "I understand," she said. She didn't say yes, doctor, or of course, or any of the deferential language that was expected. She just said she understood, the way someone understands that the sky is blue and gravity pulls downward and some people are willing to destroy other people to protect their ego. It was acknowledgement without submission. Recognition without surrender. Whitfield waited for more. When nothing came, he nodded once and left her standing by the vending machine with her coffee cooling in her hands. He had his narrative started. He had his 10 physicians ready to sign off on the conservative approach. He had his security threat delivered with 2 witnesses nowhere in sight. From where he stood, he had already won. What he didn't know was that Brooke Sullivan's hands were steady on the coffee cup because her hands had been trained to steady on far worse things. What he didn't know was that she'd survived 6 months of invisibility in his hospital specifically to see this man through a medical crisis, and that she would not let 10 physicians or 1 threatening administrator stand between a Delta Force colonel and his chance to live. The conference room at St. Michael's smelled like stale coffee and dry erase markers, the kind of institutional staleness that accumulated when 23 medical students and attending physicians packed themselves into a space designed for 12. 7 a.m. grand rounds. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the steady insistence of medical bureaucracy. Brooke stood in the back corner near the projector, summoned there by email 2 hours earlier with no explanation, her navy scrubs fitting perfectly into the institutional geometry of the room. She was invisible here. That was the point. Dr. Marcus Whitfield stood at the front with her patient chart held like evidence at trial, his silver hair catching the overhead lights in a way that suggested intentionality. He'd been chief of cardiothoracic surgery for 15 years, long enough to build hierarchies and long enough to believe they were natural law. His voice carried the precise inflection of a man accustomed to absolute deference. "Inappropriate emotional attachment to Colonel Rashid has compromised R.N. Sullivan's clinical judgment," he announced, reading directly from her documented nursing notes. He clicked the projector remote. A slide appeared showing her charting from 72 hours prior, her observation that Colonel Rashid's cardiac output remained viable for aggressive intervention despite the effusion accumulation. "This is what happens when nurses play doctor," Whitfield continued, making deliberate eye contact with students in the back row. "She believes she knows better than 10 attending physicians who unanimously recommend withdrawal of aggressive care." The students shifted. One scratched his neck. Another pretended to check her phone. Nobody wanted to be the nurse in a Whitfield story. Brooke's face remained absolutely neutral. Her jaw muscles tightened once, a contraction so minimal that only someone trained to read stress responses would have noticed it. Her hands rested at her sides, steady as surgical steel. She'd absorbed worse than this in interrogation resistance training in a basement in Ramadi with men who use sound and silence as weapons, who broke people systematically. A surgeon's public mockery registered as background noise to that calculus. But the emotion he was describing, inappropriate attachment, that part made her jaw clench a second time. He had no idea. He couldn't possibly understand that the man in the ICU 3 floors above them had once been 6 years old, screaming, caught in a burning building while firefight rounds punched through concrete around her. He didn't know that she'd pulled him out with her own hands 20 years ago, that she'd carried him through smoke and noise and fire while his small fingers clawed at her neck. He didn't know that Colonel James Rashid had grown up to be the same officer now dying in his hospital, and that his death would mean her cover remained unblown, mission complete, but her hands would spend the rest of her life remembering what they'd held. Florence Nightingale, Whitfield said, investing the words with contempt like a sneer had sound. She insists on experimental pericardial drainage protocols that contradict established end-of-life care standards. She challenges the very hierarchy that keeps patients safe, keeps order, keeps this hospital from descending into chaos where every nurse thinks she's qualified to practice medicine. 23 pairs of eyes absorbed the lesson without blinking. This was how hierarchies maintained themselves, through public demonstration. Through calculated humiliation of anyone who stepped outside the boundary Whitfield had drawn. He continued, his voice dropping slightly to suggest confidentiality shared with the room. I suspect Ms. Sullivan may be experiencing trauma-related judgment impairment. Possibly PTSD. Certainly severe complex behavior. She's not thinking clearly about this patient's best interests. She's thinking about her own need to feel heroic. Brooke didn't move. Didn't shift her weight. Her breathing remained completely even, the measured rhythm of someone who'd learned long ago that rage needed a mask. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere down the hallway, a code alarm sounded, not for Rashid, for someone else's crisis, and her body didn't respond. Just another day at St. Michael's, where 10 physicians had signed off on letting a man die, where the institutional weight of their combined authority would crush any objection Brooke raised, where the hierarchy was being demonstrated in real time for the students' benefit. 2 hours later, the vending machines on the 3rd floor became stage 2 of Whitfield's performance. Brooke was counting 4 bags, standard stocking protocol, nothing suspicious, nothing that suggested she was monitoring her patient's condition more carefully than 10 physicians believed was necessary. She heard his footsteps before he rounded the corner, the deliberate stride of someone walking to deliver a message. He wasn't alone. Chief of Medicine Robert Garrett followed, moving with the velocity of someone being pulled into a conversation he didn't quite understand but understood well enough to witness. Security is just a phone call away if certain staff members can't follow doctor's orders, Whitfield announced, speaking loud enough for a nurse passing by the adjacent hallway to pause. We've seen this pattern before. Individuals with military background who conflate combat experience with medical competency. Who believe their trauma survival credentials qualify them to override institutional consensus. Brooke turned. Met his eyes. 2 seconds of direct gaze, enough to establish she'd heard him, not enough to suggest challenge. Then she returned to the 4 bags, her hands continuing their work with mechanical precision while her entire nervous system locked down into the performance of compliance. St. Michael's isn't a battlefield, Florence, Whitfield said, and the way he used the condescending first-name intimacy made Garrett wince slightly. We have protocols here. We have established procedures. When patients reach a certain threshold, certain decisions become necessary. Those decisions aren't personal. They're medical. Brooke didn't respond. The policy was clear, a nurse who argued with a surgeon became a problem. A nurse who questioned the chain of command became a liability. A nurse who insisted her patient deserved a chance became exactly what Whitfield had described in the grand rounds, emotionally compromised, unstable, dangerous. That afternoon, outside Rashid's room, Whitfield made his move with surgical precision. He positioned himself at the doorway with 2 residents as witnesses, always a structure that prevented contradiction. His voice dropped to the register of confidentiality, the tone that suggested he was protecting her even as he dismantled her. "I'm documenting every instance of your insubordination," he said quietly, close enough that only Brooke could hear the precision of his diction. "The nursing board will receive my formal complaint about scope of practice violations by end of business. You're crossing into areas where nurses simply don't practice. Areas that require physician oversight. Areas where your judgment, however well-intentioned, is creating liability." His eyes held something that might have been sympathy if it wasn't so clearly calculated. A performance for the residents, for himself, for the architecture of his authority. "You're not special here," he continued. "You're not a decorated veteran right now. You're not a trauma survivor who understands things other people don't. You're just another nurse who forgot her place. And I'm going to help you remember where that place actually is." Brooke walked past him without response, her hand steady as she entered Rashid's room and adjusted his oxygen saturation monitor. The machine registered 92%, acceptable but declining. His heart rate had climbed to 118 during the encounter, elevated but compensatory. The effusion was progressing exactly as she predicted 72 hours ago when she documented it in notes that Whitfield had used to publicly dismantle her credibility. What he didn't know was that those hands adjusting the monitor had repaired severed carotid arteries in military field hospitals, had performed emergency procedures under fire, had applied tourniquets to limbs while rounds punched through corrugated metal walls. The hierarchy Whitfield had built over 15 years would collapse like corrugated metal the moment it collided with the actual weight of her history. But not yet. Not while Rashid needed invisibility. Not while the mission required her to remain just another nurse who'd forgotten her place. At 2 p.m., Whitfield picked up his phone in his office and dialed the number he'd memorized from 12 years of golf outings at Merion Country Club. Gerald Hoffman answered on the second ring. "Gerald. Marcus. We have a situation at St. Michael's that requires board-level attention." The conversation lasted 6 minutes. It covered Brooke's pattern of challenging medical authority, her documented emotional involvement with a patient, her apparent inability to accept consensus recommendations from 10 attending physicians. It established the framework Whitfield needed, a nurse acting outside her scope, making decisions that belong to doctors, potentially exposing the hospital to liability. Hoffman promised to look into it personally. The second call came at 3:15 p.m., routed to the Philadelphia Department of Health. Whitfield requested an urgent investigation into possible scope of practice violations by a registered nurse with undisclosed combat trauma affecting judgment. He provided her name, her patient's diagnosis, her documented disagreement with the treatment plan. He mentioned that her military background might be clouding her ability to accept physician guidance. The words were carefully chosen, technically accurate, strategically lethal. By 3:45 p.m., he'd scheduled a meeting with the chief nursing officer for the following morning. The agenda was simple: immediate administrative action pending investigation. That evening, at 11:12 p.m., Brooke sat alone in the nurse's break room, staring at an email from her naval intelligence handler, Commander Patricia Chen. Single line, encrypted channel, maintain cover. Rashid carries classified intel on Ramadi operations. Extraction not authorized. The nursing job was her mission. 8 months ago, she'd been placed at St. Michael's specifically because Colonel James Rashid, then still recovering from shrapnel extraction, had been flagged as carrying information about Black Ops extractions from Ramadi. Information that people still wanted to protect. Information that meant her continued invisibility at this hospital was operational necessity, not career choice. Blowing her cover meant mission failure. In 23 years and 4 months of service, she'd never failed a mission. Not once. Her jaw clenched. Released. Clenched again. The emotional arithmetic was clear: her career ended tomorrow morning, or Rashid died today. One of those was negotiable. She deleted the email and returned to Rashid's bedside, where his cardiac monitor showed early signs of what she'd been expecting since 72 hours ago. Pericardial effusion was advancing. Fluid was accumulating around his heart like a siege slowly tightening. His ejection fraction was declining. his heart rate compensating with increasing desperation. And 10 attending physicians, the entire institutional authority of St. Michael's, had agreed this morning that none of it was worth treating. That wasn't the worst part, though. The worst part was that somewhere in the dark hours ahead, something would give. Something would break. And when it did, when the systems that kept him alive began to fail, only one person in this hospital would be willing to do what needed to be done. The room went dead silent except for the ventilator's mechanical wheeze, steady, relentless, indifferent to everything that was about to happen. The code alarm shrieks at 3:17 a.m. Not a beep. Not a warning. A shriek, the sound of something breaking inside the machine that's been keeping Colonel James Rashid alive for 4 days, the kind of sound that turns nurses' heads like a lightning strike. Brooke moves before her conscious mind catches up. Rashid's monitor screams red numbers that shouldn't exist. Blood pressure 60/40. His jugular veins are mountains on his neck, visibly distended, purple with backup pressure. The ventilator wheeze continues its mechanical rhythm, steady, indifferent, wrong. His oxygen saturation is dropping like a stone through water. 94, 88. 79. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the pericardial sac. His own heart being crushed by what was supposed to save him. The on-call resident, Dr. Chen, is 8 minutes away minimum, stuck on I-76 behind a 3-car accident. Brooke knows this because she called ICU dispatch the moment the alarm hit. 8 minutes is 4 minutes too long. 4 minutes is the difference between a recovery and a code. She doesn't wait for authorization. She doesn't call upstairs. Hands move on their own, muscle memory from 23 years of field medicine, from Ramadi to 6 different combat hospitals, from hemorrhage to shock to the moment right before the lights go out. Her hands know what to do. Her hands have always known. The ultrasound cart rolls with one squeaking wheel. She positions it beside his bed, the transducer cold against her palm. The image appears, the pericardial sac, swollen like a water balloon, dark fluid pressing against the heart chambers. Tamponade. Clinical. Confirmed. Her voice is completely level. I need an 18-gauge needle and a sterile kit. A nurse appears, not the one who avoided her eyes. A younger one, maybe 3 years out of nursing school, moves like she understands that this is not the moment for protocol. The kit appears. Betadine swab. Sterile drapes. The needle on a syringe, already prepped. Brooke marks the insertion site with a surgical pen, just below the xiphoid process, angled 45 degrees toward the left shoulder. The anatomy is a map she's read 1,000 times. The needle is an instrument she's wielded in field tents and helicopter bays and a burning building in Iraq where a 6-year-old boy was screaming. "Stay with me, Colonel," she says quietly. "You survived worse than this." She inserts the needle. Smooth. Controlled. The resistance changes as she passes through the pericardial membrane, that subtle give that surgeons spend months learning to feel. Her hand stops. The syringe connects. She pulls back on the plunger. Dark blood appears. Not fresh red. Dark, old, accumulated. 50 milliliters. The pressure releases like a valve opening. His blood pressure reads 62/41. Still critical, but the trajectory is changing. 70 more milliliters. His pressure climbs to 78/48. 80. 90. 105/68. The oxygen saturation rises like a fever breaking. 92, 96. 98. 99. His heart rate normalizes from the desperate tachycardia that's been consuming him. The monitors stop screaming. The room goes still in that way rooms do when someone nearly dies and doesn't. The bloody syringe sits on the procedure tray, the only evidence that a nurse just performed a physician-level procedure without supervision, without orders, without the permission of the 10 attending physicians who voted yesterday to let him die. Brooke documents every detail in his chart with handwriting perfectly steady. Time of procedure, 3:17 a.m. Volume withdrawn, 120 milliliters. Fluid characteristics, sanguinous, consistent with post-traumatic pericardial effusion. Vital sign response, immediate improvement. Patient tolerating procedure well. Dr. Chen arrives at 3:25 a.m., still tucking his shirt into scrubs, and freezes in the doorway. The resident's eyes scan the bed, the ultrasound, the procedure tray, then Brooke's hands still positioned exactly where they were during the needle insertion. What happened? His voice is genuinely confused, like he's walked into a movie halfway through. Acute tamponade, Brooke says. Her voice sounds like it belongs to someone who's watched the ocean from a destroyer. Drainage at 3:17. Rapid improvement. All vitals stable. He's been stable for 6 minutes. Dr. Chen looks at the monitor. Looks at Rashid's face, peaceful now, the purple desperation gone. Looks back at Brooke like he's trying to solve an equation that doesn't have enough variables. He opens his mouth. Closes it. Just nods once and pulls up the ultrasound images. You did this? Yes. Without calling anyone? Yes. He stares at the monitor for 10 seconds, watching the steady beeping. That's the difference between death and tomorrow. Well, he says quietly, it worked. But that isn't the worst part. Dr. Whitfield arrives at 3:31 a.m., and the air in the ICU changes temperature. He's still wearing yesterday's wrinkles, a vein pulsing in his temple like something trying to break free. His eyes move from Rashid's stabilized monitor to the bloody syringe on the procedure tray to Brooke's face, and she watches him understand exactly what happened and exactly what that means for the authority he's spent 15 years building. He doesn't speak to her. He walks directly to the nurse's station and pulls his phone from his pocket. His voice carries across the ICU, not loud, but carrying, the voice of a man who wants witnesses. Yes, this is Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery Whitfield at St. Michael's. I need to report a scope of practice violation. He pauses, listening. An RN, Brooke Sullivan, badge number 847, performed a physician-only pericardiocentesis without supervision, without orders, without attending physician presence. It occurred at 0317 hours this morning. Another pause. I have 2 nurse witnesses. I have the procedure tray. I have her written documentation. He hangs up and immediately dials again. His eyes lock on Brooke's for exactly 1 second, a vein in his forehead pulsing like it's keeping time. Gerald, it's Marcus Whitfield. His voice drops an octave. We have a situation with that nurse I mentioned. Sullivan. She just performed emergency surgery-level procedure on the Delta Force case without authorization. I'm documenting it now. I need you to move on the board review. Today. Before she does something worse. He pauses. No, this isn't discretionary. This is grounds for immediate termination and mandatory investigation by the Department of Health. He hangs up. Steps closer to the ICU desk. Announces to every nurse, every resident, every attending who's drifting in at 3:31 a.m. to check on their patients, effective immediately, RN Sullivan is on administrative leave pending formal board investigation. She is not to perform any patient care, not to access the medication dispensary, and not to access any patient charts. Security will escort her from the premises at shift change. This is non-negotiable. Brooke's hands don't shake. Her jaw doesn't clench visibly. She simply continues writing in Rashid's chart, her surgical pen moving across the page with the precision of someone who's documented dying men on helicopter decks while artillery fire shook the fuselage. Her handwriting is teacher-perfect, clinical, impeccable. Procedure notes. Vital sign documentation. Post-intervention assessment. Whitfield's face deepens to a shade of purple that concerns her professionally. The vein in his temple is working overtime. Did you hear me, Sullivan? You're off this case. You're off this floor. You're off duty. She doesn't look up. Heard clearly, Doctor. Don't take that tone with me. No tone, Doctor. Acknowledging instructions. Her pen keeps moving. The clinical documentation of how she saved a man's life continues, perfectly calm, perfectly permanent, perfectly protected by every hospital policy she followed, while Whitfield stood outside the room 2 minutes too late. 2 nurses look away. One stares at the floor. The third, the one who appeared with the sterile kit without being asked, makes brief eye contact with Brooke. Her eyes are saying something. "Thank you." Witness: "I saw." Whitfield turns on his heel and walks back to his office. His phone begins ringing before he's halfway down the corridor. The hospital administrator. The board chairman. The medical director. His phone call to the Department of Health inspector has already triggered a response. By 4 a.m., the wheels he set in motion will be destroying her credibility by lunchtime. He doesn't know that Brooke's phone, the one locked in her locker, the one with a direct line to naval intelligence, is already ringing with its own cascade of consequences. He doesn't know that a colonel who was supposed to die yesterday is going to be coherent enough by 6 a.m. to tell the visiting admiral exactly who saved his life and why her credentials are classified. He doesn't know that the 10 attending physicians who voted yesterday to withdraw care just got their mortality rate compared against a nurse with 23 years of field medicine and a perfect survival record. But at 3:32 a.m., in the silent hospital corridor, Dr. Whitfield's career is beginning its slow collapse. He just doesn't know it yet. And Brooke, sitting at the nurse's station with Rashid's chart still open in front of her, documents one final note: patient stable. All vitals within normal limits. Recommend continued cardiac monitoring. RN Sullivan aware of all parameters. Then she stands, walks to the break room, and makes herself a cup of coffee. Her hands are steady. Her breathing is steady. Everything about her is steady except for one single moment, just long enough for nobody to see it, when she touches the worn leather of the combat boots she keeps in her locker and thinks about a boy screaming in a burning building, about second chances, about the difference between following orders and saving lives. The coffee tastes like metal and time and 23 years of service. By sunrise, everything will change. The coffee tastes like metal and time and 23 years of service. By sunrise, everything will change. Whitfield's office door closes at 7:14 a.m. He doesn't knock. He calls. The phone rings 3 times before Gerald Hoffman picks up, golf partner, board chairman, member of the same country club for 16 years where they discussed the Phillies over 18-hole rounds and overpriced gin and tonics. Gerald. We have a scope of practice violation in cardiothoracic. An RN performed an unauthorized pericardiocentesis at 3:17 this morning without attending supervision. Whitfield's voice carries the flat precision of a man reciting facts. The patient is alive, which complicates things, but the protocol violation is documented. I need the board to move quickly on this. Hoffman's pause lasts exactly 4 seconds. How serious? Serious enough that it undermines every standard we've built. She's a liability, Gerald. A good nurse with a hero complex is still a liability. The conversation lasts 8 minutes. Whitfield hangs up first. He doesn't wait for confirmation. He knows how these things move. One phone call to the chairman triggers another to administration, which triggers council, which triggers the board's legal review. By Thursday, she'll be gone. But Thursday is too slow. Thursday is a risk. The second call comes at 7:43 a.m. This one goes to the Philadelphia Department of Health, Bureau of Professional and Occupational Affairs. Whitfield has the number memorized. He's used it twice before on 2 different nurses, both for minor violations that never stuck. This time he uses the word emergency. This time he uses the word unmonitored. The investigator he reaches is a former ER nurse named Patricia Valdez, someone who understands institutional hierarchy the way only people who've lived inside it understand it. I want to file a formal complaint regarding scope of practice violation. Registered nurse Brooke Sullivan, license number 247891, PA, performed an invasive cardiac procedure, pericardiocentesis, without attending physician authorization. Whitfield's tone carries the weight of a man protecting patient safety, not destroying a career. I documented it immediately. The incident report was filed at 3:52 a.m. I'm concerned about what else might happen if this goes unaddressed. Valdez asks 3 questions. Whitfield answers each one with the precision of testimony. Yes, the patient survived. Yes, the RN is still on shift. No, she hasn't mentioned the procedure to anyone else, which suggests she's aware of the violation. The call ends with a promised investigation within 48 hours. Whitfield sets the phone down and opens the window blinds. He can see the parking lot from his office on the 4th floor, the morning light just beginning to touch the asphalt, the spot where she'll walk out in approximately 4 hours and 23 minutes. The security office is in the basement, past the laundry and the mechanical rooms where the hospital's heartbeat lives, generators and vac systems and the low hum of industrial machines that keep everything else functioning. Security Officer Marcus Webb is a Desert Storm veteran with a 1st Infantry Division tattoo fading on his forearm like old camouflage. He's been with St. Michael's for 9 years and he knows the sound of authority when he hears it. HR calls at 11:13 a.m. 20 minutes later, Webb is walking up to the ICU floor with a cardboard box under one arm. He doesn't look at Whitfield. He doesn't need to. Brooke is checking Rashid's morning labs when Webb appears beside the medication cart. She knows what the box means before he speaks. Administrative leave, effective immediately. We need to secure your locker. His voice carries the flat professionalism of someone delivering news he doesn't believe in. They walk in silence, the hallway floor reflects the fluorescent ceiling lights like a sheet of troubled water. Her locker is on the 4th floor, in the break room where the vending machines hum their mechanical song and the coffee machine gurgles water that tastes like despair. Brooke opens the combination lock and begins packing. Her spare scrubs. Her phone charger. The small bottle of ibuprofen she keeps for 16-hour shifts. The photograph of her parents, both long dead, both proud. The combat boots go in first. Webb watches her lift them from the locker's bottom shelf, still crusted with Ramadi sand, actual Iraqi sand that has survived 9 years of rain and concrete and hospital floors because she's never cleaned them, not once in 20 years. The sand is data. The sand is proof. Webb's jaw tightens. He glances at the boots again, then at her face, and something shifts in his expression like a door opening in a place he'd kept locked. He doesn't speak. He pretends to check his phone while she finishes packing. His eyes linger on the boots for 3 full seconds longer than they should. When Whitfield appears at the ICU entrance, a shadow in the hallway, watching through the glass, Webb meets her at the elevator with the box secured in both hands. She doesn't look at Whitfield. She doesn't give him the satisfaction of that moment. Her walk to the parking garage takes 45 seconds. Her badge is confiscated by HR at the ground floor exit. They cut it in half with surgical precision, snip, snip, 2 pieces falling into a red waste bin like the end of something that mattered. What happens next doesn't just end a career. It sets fire to everything built on false authority. The Philadelphia Inquirer receives an anonymous tip at 1:34 p.m. St. Michael's Hospital RN suspended after an authorized cardiac procedure. The article goes live at 2:19 p.m. Whitfield forwards it to 5 colleagues at 3:01 p.m. with a note, "This is how we maintain standards. Do not hesitate to report violations. Patient safety demands accountability." The email sits in 5 inboxes. 4 of those doctors read it and scroll past. One of those doctors is Dr. Raymond Chen at Johns Hopkins, Whitfield's mentor, the man who taught him that surgeons bear the weight of impossible choices every single day. The parking garage at St. Michael's has 8 levels, each one descending further into shadow and concrete and the smell of things corroding in darkness. Level P3 is where the overhead lights flicker and fail, where the air tastes like diesel exhaust and old oil stains that won't wash out. Brooke parks her decade-old Honda Civic, 2009 model with 247,000 miles and a check engine light she's ignored for 14 months, in a spot near the far wall where nobody parks, where the security cameras have dead zones because nobody designed this place thinking about people who need to disappear. Engine off. Forehead against steering wheel. Both hands gripping at 10 and 2 like she's trying to hold something together that's already falling apart. She's been sitting like this for 27 minutes when her phone buzzes. Not a call. A text. From Commander Chen at Naval Intelligence, her direct handler for the past 8 months, hold position. Do not break cover. 3 words. The entire operation compressed into 3 syllables. Hold means stay. Position means where you are. Do not break cover means every emotion she's spent 23 years learning to weaponize instead of express has to stay locked down behind a face that shows nothing. The text doesn't ask questions. It doesn't offer solutions. It confirms that someone upstairs knows exactly what happened, knows that she performed a procedure without authorization, knows that the hospital has begun moving against her, knows that the next 72 hours are going to test whether her identity as Brooke Sullivan the nurse can survive collision with her identity as Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan of Naval Intelligence. For the first time since Ramadi, her hands start to shake. Not fear. Not panic. Restraint. The tremor of someone who has spent 23 years holding infinite pressure inside a space designed for mortal limitations. She presses her forehead harder against the steering wheel, the rubber cool, the motion small enough that no security camera could possibly capture it, no witness could possibly interpret it as weakness. Her fingers whiten against the wheel's leather grip. She reaches for the ignition. Her hand stops. If she turns that key, she leaves. If she leaves, she breaks cover. If she breaks cover, then everything, the 8 months of surveillance, the classified operations, the mission parameters that have consumed her entire life since the day she found out that the 6-year-old boy she saved in Ramadi had grown up to become a Delta Force colonel carrying intelligence that could reshape operations across the entire Middle East, everything becomes mission failure. 23 years without failure. 23 years of compartmentalization so complete that she sometimes forgets which version of herself is real. The nurse who cares about patients. The operative who reports to intelligence officers using call signs instead of names. The woman who bleeds with the same red blood as everyone else, who holds loss the way others hold grief, who learned in Ramadi that the difference between a hero and a casualty is often just luck and the willingness to run through fire. She closes her eyes. Her hand stops shaking. The parking garage smells like concrete and exhaust and the slow death of expensive machinery. Outside, Philadelphia is moving toward evening in the way cities move, traffic and commerce, and people who don't know that a combat veteran is sitting in a basement parking garage unable to turn a key because turning it means admitting that some missions don't end in victory, they just end in different kinds of survival. Her phone buzzes again. Same sender. Same message. Hold position. Do not break cover. She doesn't move. The UH-60 Black Hawk landed on St. Michael's rooftop helipad at dawn, rotors still turning as 2 Marines in dress blues descended the stairs, their uniforms pressed sharp enough to draw blood. They moved through the ICU corridors with a kind of purpose that made people step aside without being asked, boots echoing against tile in perfect synchronization. The veteran security guard, Webb, who'd pulled 3 tours in Kandahar, looked at their faces and snapped to attention before they even spoke, his hand rising instinctively. The younger Marine approached the nurse's station, gaze steady as a laser sight. "We need to speak with Trident 6. Now." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. The entire floor heard them. The fluorescent light seemed to buzz louder in the silence that followed. Every head turned. Every monitor beeped on, as if the machines themselves were waiting. That wasn't a request. It was a command. Brooke was standing at Rashid's bedside, checking the cardiac monitor's readout with her jaw set the way it always was, spine straight, shoulders level, no visible reaction to the sound of military boots on linoleum. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She'd been waiting for this. 20 years waiting. 8 months watching. 3 days of parking garage silence. Her hands kept moving on the blood pressure cuff, steady as surgical instruments, because the mission wasn't over until she heard the words. One of the Marines stood in the doorway. The other continued to Rashid's room. The doors swung open like they'd been waiting for permission to do so. Behind them walked a two-star admiral in dress whites, shoulder boards catching the morning light like fresh snow on a battlefield, and his presence made the air pressure change, the kind of calm that only comes from someone who'd made decisions that cost lives and lived with it. He was holding a folder. Thick. Classified markings stamped across the cover in red. He opened it without preamble, and began to read. The voice moved like a tank idling in a garage, low, methodical, unstoppable. Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. 23 years, 7 months active service. 3 Bronze Stars. He paused. The Admiral let that sit for 2 full seconds. Everyone in the ICU heard it. Bronze Star. The first one landed like a punch. 2 Purple Hearts. Another pause. Longer this time. The chart recorder hissed as it printed Rashid's vitals. 14 combat deployments. The numbers climbed higher, each one a different weight. The Admiral's eyes moved to Rashid, who was sitting up now, conscious for the first time in 11 days, the oxygen cannula removed from his face, and something shifted behind his eyes, a recognition that wasn't medical, wasn't clinical. It was memory. The kind that lives in muscle and bone. The Admiral closed the folder slowly. And 14 years, 6 months of operational service with naval intelligence at this facility. The silence that followed was so thick you could have performed surgery in it. Brooke didn't move. Didn't breathe differently. Didn't acknowledge any of it. But Rashid's hand came up from the bed, trembling, not from weakness but from something far deeper, and he looked directly at her. The words came out barely above a whisper. You. That day. The fire. His voice cracked like old leather. I was 6. The building was burning. There were gunshots everywhere and you ran through all of it. I remember smoke. I remember your voice telling me to hold on. You carried me for 3 blocks while everything was falling. He stopped, breathing hard now, eyes wet. You saved me when I was 6 years old. And you kept fighting to save me again. Those bastards tried to stop you. Those 10 doctors. But you didn't stop. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain starting outside, each drop hitting the window like the beginning of something. Rashid's chest was rising and falling faster now, color flooding back into his face that had been grey for weeks. I didn't remember when I came in. The shrapnel. The blast damage. But yesterday when I woke up and saw your face, everything came back. Everything. You're the reason I'm alive twice over. Whitfield's phone vibrated in his pocket. And then again. And again. He was in his office on the 3rd floor, door closed, staring at his diplomas on the wall, Johns Hopkins Medical School, framed surgical fellowship, photographs with 3 department heads and a senator at a hospital gala. His hand moved to the phone slowly. The first text was from his medical school mentor, Dr. Robert Hutchins, the man who'd guided him through residency, written his letters of recommendation, sponsored his membership in the American College of Surgeons. The message was 9 words long and it moved through him like ice water down a spine. I taught you better than this. You're a disgrace. Don't use my name again. Before he could process it, another text arrived. Then another. A third. Then his email began lighting up. Colleagues who'd praised his surgical technique. Former residents he'd trained. The hospital's board chairman. The messages were all the same tone, not angry. Worse. Disappointed. Disgusted. One from a trauma surgeon he'd worked with at Johns Hopkins, watched the security footage. You humiliated a decorated combat veteran for saving a patient's life. I don't know you anymore. By 9:30, the hospital board had convened an emergency session in the executive conference room on the 15th floor. Gerald Hoffman, the chairman, opened security footage on the projector in the dark-paneled room where decisions got made, the vending machine confrontation, the grand rounds humiliation, the threat about security. Every word. Every cold stare. Every moment of Brooke standing absolutely motionless while he tried to break her. The footage ran for 3 minutes and 17 seconds. Nobody spoke during it. Nobody spoke for 30 seconds after it ended. Hoffman looked at each board member in turn. The vote is unanimous. Immediate termination. He has until 5 p.m. to remove his personal items from this facility. The meeting with Whitfield lasted exactly 3 minutes. He tried to argue. Scope of practice violations. Patient safety protocols. The 10 attending physicians who'd recommended withdrawal of care. Hoffman cut him off with a gesture that was almost kind, which somehow made it worse. She was right. You were protecting your authority, not her patient. Clean out your office. By 2 p.m., the Philadelphia Inquirer had published a retraction and a new investigation. By 3 p.m., his medical school mentor had shared their text exchange with the Johns Hopkins Alumni Association. By 4 p.m., 3 former residents had issued public statements about his pattern of hierarchical abuse, detailed, specific, and devastating. By 6 p.m., Whitfield sat in his empty office, walls bare now, shelves cleared, the folder from his residency packed in a cardboard box, and watched his name trend on medical Twitter with the hashtag #float like a Master Chief. The Pennsylvania Medical Board opened an investigation at 7:43 a.m. the next morning. His research collaboration with Johns Hopkins was cancelled by email. 3 speaking invitations disappeared. His photo appeared in a medical licensing newsletter 6 months later, no longer at St. Michael's, no longer in a white coat, no longer a surgeon. Instead, behind a folding table at a strip mall insurance agency in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, his polo shirt wrinkled, the insurance company logo embroidered over his heart where his surgical credentials used to be, hawking supplemental policies to customers who'd never heard of him. He was 48 years old and had become invisible. 3 days after the board review, Brooke returned to St. Michael's on a Thursday morning. She wore her scrubs, standard navy blue, nothing different, but the Master Chief insignia hung visibly on a chain beneath her collar, the gold catching the fluorescent light like a signal flare. The ICU staff stood when she walked in. Every single person. She didn't smile, just nodded once and went directly to Rashid's room. He was sitting up, the oxygen cannula off his face, color restored, his eyes clear and focused. "I remember you," he said quietly. Not a greeting. A statement of fact. A piece of his life clicking into place. She pulled up a chair and sat down without speaking. Outside the window, a charter bus pulled into St. Michael's main entrance, and the doors opened to 42 people, children, teenagers, adults, families, all of them Iraqi, all of them carrying signs, "Thank you Master Chief" and "Ramadi remembers," and photographs of a girl in a schoolyard that didn't exist 20 years ago. They filed through the lobby slowly, reverently, the way you move through a place you know is holy. Admiral Keller presented Brooke with orders returning her to active intelligence duty with a commendation for maintaining operational security under extreme duress. Commander Chen arrived with a handwritten note from the Secretary of the Navy. Security Officer Webb saluted her in the hallway, a proper salute, the kind you give a Master Chief, his hand rising sharp and clean. That evening, Brooke stood at Rashid's window watching the Iraqi families gather in the courtyard below, children playing on grass their parents had only dreamed they'd see. She didn't smile, but her shoulders dropped half an inch, the first visible relaxation anyone had witnessed in 8 months. Rashid watched her profile and said quietly, "You lost your job fighting for me." She shook her head slightly. "I didn't lose anything. I just found what I saved." Her combat boots were back on the shelf in her reopened locker, sand still in the laces, next to her Master Chief cover and a photograph of 12 Iraqi children standing in front of a school that hadn't existed 2 decades ago. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Sometimes you don't recognize the warrior until the room goes silent and you see what they're protecting. That's when you understand. That's always when you understand. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, smash that like button. Subscribe for more stories about the ones who fight for us in the dark. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Brooke's position?